Naturalism. Naturalism is sometimes claimed to give an even more accurate depiction of life than realism. But naturalism is not only like realism, a special selection of subject matter and a special way of rendering those materials. It is a mode of fiction that was developed by a school of writers in accordance with a particular philosophical thesis. This thesis, a product of post Darwinian biology in the 19th century, held that a human being exists entirely in the order of nature and does not have a soul nor any access to a religious or spiritual world beyond the natural world, and therefore that such a being is merely a higher order animal whose character and behavior are entirely determined by two kinds of forces: heredity and environment. The French novelist Émile Zola, beginning in the 1870s, did much to develop this theory in what he called Les Roman experimental. That is, the novel organized in the mode of a scientific experiment on the behavior under given conditions of the character it depicts. Zola and later naturalistic writers choose characters who exhibit strong animal drives such as greed and sexual desire, and who are helpless victims both of glandular secretions within and of sociological pressures without. The end of the naturalistic novel is usually tragic, but not as in classical and Elizabethan tragedy because of a heroic but losing struggle of the individual mind and will against God's enemies and circumstances. Aspects of the naturalistic selection and management of subject matter and its austere or harsh manner of rendering its materials are apparent in many modern novels and dramas such as Hardy's Jude the Obscure, various plays by Eugene O'Neill in the 1920s, and Norman Mailer's novel of Second World War, The Naked and the Dead. You will get more examples on page number 335 of the 10th edition of M.H. Abrams, A Glossary of Literary Terms. So, movements originally opposed to both 19th century realism and naturalism are expressionism and symbolism. So, next topic is symbolism. Various poets of the Romantic period in Germany, in England, often used private symbols in their poetry. And sustained symbolism, that is, a coherent system composed of a number of symbolic elements in both lyric poems and long prophetic epic poems. In 19th century America, a symbolist procedure was a prominent element in the novels of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, the prose of Emerson and Thoreau, and poetic theory and practice of Poe. These writers derived the mode in large part from the native Puritan tradition of divine typology. In the usage of literary historians, however, symbolist movement designates specifically a group of French writers, beginning with Charles Baudelaire and including such later poets such as Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Verlaine, Stephen Mallarmé, and Paul Valéry. Baudelaire based the symbolic mode of his poem in the part on the example of the American Edgar Allan Poe, but especially on the ancient belief in correspondences, the doctrine that there exist inherent and systematic analogies between the human mind and the outer world, and also between the material and the spiritual world. The techniques of the French symbolists who exploited in order of private symbols in a poetry of rich suggestiveness rather than explicit signification had an immense influence throughout Europe and in England, and American poets such as Arthur Symons and Ernest Dawson, as well as W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, Dylan Thomas, Walt Stevens, etc. So, major symbolist poets in Germany are Stephen George and Rainer Maria Rilke. The modern period in the decades after First World War was a notable era of symbolism in literature. Many of the major writers of the period exploit symbols which are in part drawn from religious and esoteric traditions and in part invented. Some of the works of the age are symbolist in their settings, their agents, and their actions, as well as in the objects they refer to. You'll get more details about the symbolism on page 397 and 398 on the same book. Next, we are moving on to Russian formalism, a type of literary theory and analysis which originated in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the second decade of the 20th century. At first, opponents of the movement of Russian formalism applied the term formalism derogatorily because of its focus on the patterns and technical devices of literature to the exclusion of its subject matter and social values. Later, however, it became a neutral designation. Among the leading representatives of the movement were Boris Eschenbaum, Victor Shklovsky, and Roman Jakobson. Formalism views literature primarily as a specialized use of language and proposes a fundamental opposition between the literary or poetical use of language and the ordinary practical use of language. It proposes that the central function of ordinary language is to communicate to auditors message or information by references to the world existing outside of the language. In contrast, it conceives literary language to be self focused, in that it functions is not to convey information by making eccentric references, but to offer the reader a special mode of experience by drawing attention to its own formal features, that is, to the qualities and the internal relations of the linguistic signs themselves. The primary aim of literature in foregrounding its linguistic medium, as Victor Shklovsky put it in an influential formulation, is to estrange or defamiliarize, that is, by disrupting the modes of ordinary linguistic discourse. Literature makes strange the world of everyday perception and renews the reader's lost capacity for fresh sensation. The formalist stresses the function of purely literary devices to produce the effect of freshness in the reader's experience of a literary work. Some of the fruitful work of Jacobson and others, valid outside the formalist perspective, has been in the analysis of meter and of the repetitions of the sounds in alliteration and rhyme. Formalists have also made influential contribution to the theory of prose fiction. That is the difference between the story and a plot. An author is said to transform the raw material of a story into a literary plot by the use of a variety of devices that violate sequence and that deform and defamiliarize the story elements. American New Criticism, although it developed independently, it sometimes called formalist because, like European formalism, it stresses the analysis of the literary work as a self-sufficient verbal entity constituted by internal relations and independent references either to the state of the mind of the author or to the actualities of the external world. Unlike the European formalists, however, the new critics did not apply the science of linguistics to poetry, and their emphasis was not on a work as constituted by the linguistic devices for achieving specifically literary effects, but on the complex interplay within the work of ironic, paradoxical, and metaphoric meanings around a humanly important theme. The main influence of Russian and the Czech formalism on American criticism has been on the developments of stylistics and of narratology. Towards the end of the last century, the formalist approach found a number of theoretical advocates. This return to formalism, building on a renewed interest in metrics and in aesthetics, at first was proposed primarily as a reaction against the new historicism, But within a few years, what became known as the new formalism proposed a positive program undertaking to connect the formal aspects of literature to the historical, political, and worldly concerns, in opposition to which the formalist movement had earlier defined itself. So, you can refer to pages 138, 139, 140, and 141 for referring Russian formalism. Strong opposition to formalism in both its European and American varieties has been voiced by some Marxist critics. So, the next topic is Marxism. Marxist criticism, in its diverse forms, grounds its theory and practice on the economic and cultural theory of Karl Marx and his fellow thinker Friedrich Engels, and especially on the following claims. First one, in the last analysis, the evolving history of humankind, of its social groupings and interrelations, of its institutions, and of its ways of thinking are largely determined by the changing mode of its material production, that is, of its overall economic organization for producing and distributing material goods. Second, changes in the fundamental mode of material production effect changes in the class structure of a society, establishing in each era dominant and subordinate classes that engage in a struggle for economic, political, and social advantage. Human consciousness is constituted by an ideology, that is, the beliefs, values, and ways of thinking and feeling through which human beings perceive and by recourse to which they explain what they take to be reality. An ideology is in complex ways a product of the position and interest of a particular class. A Marxist critic typically undertakes to explain the literature in any historical era not as works created in accordance with the timeless artistic criteria, but as products of the economic and ideological determinants specific to that era. What some Marxist critics themselves decreed as vulgar Marxism analyzed a bourgeoisie literary work as in direct correlation with the present stage of the class struggle and demanded that such works be replaced by a social realism that would represent the true reality and the progressive forces of our time in practice. This usually turned out to be the demand that literature conform to an official party line. There are many terms related to Marxism that has been explained in the pages from 203 to 210. So you have to go through all these very, very carefully. Some of the important terms are ideology, base and superstructure, Frankfurt School of the German Marxist, interpellates, hegemony, and post-Marxism is also important. Next topic is structuralism. Almost all literary theorists, beginning with Aristotle, have emphasized the importance of structure, conceived in diverse ways in analyzing a work of literature. Structuralist criticism, however, now designates a practice of critics who analyze literature on the explicit model of structuralist linguists. The class includes a number of Russian formalists, especially Roman Jakobson, but consists most prominently of a group of writers with their headquarters in Paris, who apply to literature the concepts and analytic distinctions developed by Ferdinand de Saussure in his course in general linguistics. This mode of criticism is part of a larger movement, French structuralism, inaugurated in the 1950s by the structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who analyzed on the model of Saussure's linguist such cultural phenomena as mythology, kinship relations, and modes of preparing food. You can refer to page 381, 382, 383, and 384 to get the details and explanations about structuralism. Structuralist criticism conceives literature to be a second order signifying system that uses the first order structural system of language as its medium and is itself to be analyzed primarily on the model of linguistic theory. Structuralist critics often apply a variety of linguistic concepts to the analysis of a literary text, such as a distinction between phonemic and morphemic levels of organization, or between the paradigmatic and syntagmatic relationships. And some critics analyze the structure of a literary text on the model of the syntax in a well formed sentence. There are many terms related to structuralism, that is a Lang and Parole, binary opposition, etc. You have to refer all those terms, they are very important. In the structuralist view, what had been called a literary work becomes a text, that is, a mode of writing constituted by a play of internal elements according to specifically literary conventions and codes. The individual author or subject is not assigned any initiative, expressive intentions, or design as the origin or producer of a work. Instead, the conscious self is declared to be a construct that is itself the product of the workings of the linguistic system, and the mind of an author is described as an imputed space within which the impersonal, always already existing system of literary language, conventions, codes, and rules of combination gets precipitated into a particular text. So, structuralism replaces the author with the reader as a central agency in criticism. But the traditional reader, as a conscious, purposeful, and feeling individual, is replaced by the impersonal activity of reading. And what is read is not a work imbued with meanings, but écriture writing. Écriture is another important term, and also the very important sign, signifier, and signified. Semiotics, stylistics, narrative, and narratology are also related to structuralism. Now we are moving on to post-structuralism. From the pages 308 to 314, you will get the explanations about post-structuralism. Post-structuralism designates a broad variety of critical perspectives and procedures that in the 1970s displaced structuralism from its prominence as a radically innovative way of dealing with language and other signifying systems. A conspicuous announcement to the American scholars of the post-structural point of view was Jacques Derrida's paper on structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences, delivered in 1966 to an international colloquium at Johns Hopkins University. Derrida attacked the systematic, quasi-scientific pretensions of the strict form of structuralism derived from Saussure's concept of the structure of language and represented by the cultural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss by asserting that the notion of a systematic structure, whether linguistic or other, presupposes a fixed center that serves to organize and regulate the structure, yet itself escapes structurality. The salient features of post-structuralism are: in post-structural criticism, what is called theory came to be foregrounded, so that many critics felt it incumbent to theorize their individual positions and practices. The nature of theory, however, was conceived in a new and very inclusive way, for the word theory, standing without qualification, often designated an account of the general conditions of signification that determine meaning and interpretation to all domains of the human action, production, and intellection. A prominent aspect of post-structural theories is that they are posed in opposition to inherited ways of thinking in all provinces of knowledge. And the second feature is the decentering of the subject. The oppositional stance of many post-structural critics is manifested in a sharp critique of what they called humanism, that is, of the traditional view that human being or human author is a coherent identity. endowed with purpose and initiative, whose design and intentions effectuate the form and meaning of a literary or other product. For such traditional terms as human being or individual or self, post structuralists tend to substitute subject because this word is divested of the connotation that it has originating or controlling power, and instead suggests that the human being is subjected to the play of external forces. And also because the word suggests the grammatical term, the subject of a sentence, which is an empty slot to be filled by whoever happens to be speaking at a particular time and space. There are references to the work of Paul de Man, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, etc. You have to go through all that details. And the third feature is that reading, text, and writing. The decentering or deletion of the author leaves the reader or interpreter as a focal figure in post-structural accounts of signifying practices. This figure, however, like the author, is stripped of the traditional attributes of purposiveness and initiative and converted into an impersonal process called reading. So, what this reading engages is no longer called a literary work. Instead, reading engages a text, that is, a structure of signifiers regarded merely as a given for the reading process. And the fourth feature is that the concept of discourse. Literary critics had long made casual use of the term discourse, especially in application to passages representing conversations between characters in a literary work. And in the 1970s, they developed a critical practice called discourse analysis, which focuses on such conversational exchanges. So, this type of criticism deals with the literary discourse as conducted by human characters whose voices engage in a dynamic interchange of beliefs, attitudes, sentiments, and other expressions of states of consciousness. There are many other terms related to post-structuralism, that is a subtext, hermeneutics of suspicion, relativism, new pragmatism. All these are related to the main idea of post-structuralism. So you have to look through all of these. It's very important. So that's all for today. There are some more movements and terms to be discussed that we will do in the next class. Thank you.